I want to preface this video with the sort of caveat / warning that I have no pictures to share about it other than this. There's no trailer that has come out about it, so I would have loved to have screen captured some of the images from the film to show kind of in my slideshow, but when I put the movie on pause, it had the big fat play button in the middle of it, so I was like, nah, I'm not going to do that. I guess at some point the trailer will come out. I don't know what the release date for this film is, so obviously have no idea when a trailer will be made available, but there's that. Just kind of wanted to sort of give you a heads up as to why the presentation isn't typical for my other review videos. Okay, on to the review. So tonight I participated in my first ever screening of a Sundance movie. Well, I wouldn't say I participated, I just screened it. I didn't have anything to do with it, I was just watching it. It was interesting. I found out that Sundance was doing the virtual screenings, I think maybe last year, and so when it came around this year, I'd forgotten all about it. I didn't remember until Sundance was already going on for like a day or so, and then I was like, oh yeah. So then I found some films that interested me. I would have loved to have been able to watch as many of them as I wanted, but I wasn't going to buy a film package. I was only going to buy like one ticket at a time, and that would add up if you did one ticket at a time. So I'm being very selective. I might watch one more. I'm not sure. As of now, I've only watched one, and it was a movie called Watcher, and the director is someone by the name of Chloe Okuno. I'd never heard of her before. Apparently, this is her first full-length feature film. She'd done a short film before this or something like this, or something like that. These were things I found out about when I was watching the Q&A after the screening. And it was interesting. I almost stopped listening to the Q&A in the early minutes of it based on some comments that the director was making. It was just like a eyeball rolling, and it was kind of annoying. I'll get to that in a bit. But I'm glad I went ahead and just listened all the way through, because they brought up different things that I had kind of thought of while I was watching the film and taken notes on as I was watching it in preparation for the review. So the premise of the story is that this girl and her, well, I think they said her fiance, but I assumed they were married. I thought they were married. They both had wedding bands on. So that summary wasn't accurate, the summary I read elsewhere. But anyway, this woman and her husband, they moved to Romania because he's gotten a job promotion. He's supposed to be like part Romanian, so he can speak the language fluently. She cannot. She doesn't know hardly any Romanian at all. So right off the bat, she's being put in this environment where she feels very isolated. And isolation seems to be kind of a recurring sort of, or sort of an underlying theme to the movie, and how she feels detached from things around her because she can't participate in society as much, as she would like to because of the language barrier. So she's basically, she just kind of cooped up in her house or her apartment, and she starts to notice what she thinks is this person watching them from across the way in the other apartment complex. And she begins to get a bit paranoid. She feels like the person that's watching her is the same one that has been following her. And also there have been reports of a serial killer in the area. So she's definitely, her paranoia level amps up. I don't know that she makes the connection between this strange guy watching and possibly following her and the possibility that, maybe he's a serial killer. I'm not quite sure if that connection is made in her mind, but it certainly is something that's kind of planted in your brain for the viewer. So that's the basic premise. And also the fact that the people around her don't really believe her concerns. They don't really buy into it because Okay, well, that's something that I want to touch on when I'm talking about this. And another thing that I wanted to mention before I forget is that as I was watching this movie, I was reminded of movies like Rear Window, an Alfred Hitchcock movie. And I noticed after I watched the film that there were references in multiple reviews about this being kind of Hitchcockian, and they talked about Rear Window. And I was thinking the same thing because the scenario is very similar. Someone observes something or thinks they've observed something, but nobody around them believes, what they're saying. They don't believe that the situation is really serious. They just think maybe they're imagining things or whatever. Very, very similar type of theme to that. And so that was one of the things I appreciated about this film. It's a horror film, suspense film, but I have to say that it really is more of a slow burn type of thing. Stuff doesn't start happening like crazy. There really is no intense sort of action throughout. There are some moments where certainly suspense is amped up just because of the way the scene plays out, and you're like, holy cow, that's tenseful. And then it will kind of shift. Like the movie went in directions I wasn't really expecting. Things would happen that I didn't really expect. It wasn't anything that like completely surprised me, but I was thinking that in a lot of ways it was going to take the typical sort of formulaic route that a lot of films, horror type films take. And in some aspects it does do that a little bit, but not overly. I would think something was going to happen and then it wouldn't. And I was like, oh, okay, well, so then we're going off in this direction. So I appreciated that it did that it had those aspects of not feeling like your typical formula in some ways, but yet in other ways it was. Because a lot of these types of films they follow a pattern. And this one did, but in some ways it didn't. It's hard to explain without getting into spoilery territory, which I don't want to do. So anyway, let's continue on. So something also about her situation is that, as I mentioned, isolation. So she doesn't just have the physical isolation by the fact that she doesn't have a job. She's just in the apartment there. Her husband goes off to work. She's alone all day long. She goes out and ventures every once in a while, but she's physically isolated. And like I said, she's socially isolated because of the language barrier. And that certainly does play a part in showing you how she feels. Like everybody around her speaking Romanian. Her husband will translate for her a lot, but sometimes he just kind of talks freely in Romanian in front of her with, like, let's say they have guests over and they're all speaking Romanian, and every once in a while they'll revert to English. They can all speak English, but the Romanians just speak Romanian in front of her without sort of bringing her into the conversation. So you can feel how kind of disconnected she must be, or that sense of disconnection she has to have in that moment. You can identify, it's like, wow, that's really awkward. And you're like, why don't they just speak English? But, it's just, I guess this is something that happens a lot of times, like people, they're going to slip back into their native language. It's easier, but you can sympathize with the situation that she's in, and she's completely dependent on whatever her husband decides to translate for her or not. She does pick up some Romanian along the way, and there is an instance at some point in the film where she's picked up enough Romanian that she can tell that her husband has said something kind of like joking about her, but she does not take that well at all. And there's this big conflict and sort of explosive conflict between them when that happens. But that's at the point in the movie when things have really gotten very, very tense and hard between them, because she's saying these things. He's trying to be attentive and helpful and try to fix the situation, but he's also kind of at his wit's end, because the deal about this movie is that you could So this fella that she thinks is following her, that she thinks is watching her, he's strange, but at the same time, her interpretation of the situation could be completely off. And then at the same time, he could be reading bad intentions into her behavior. So you could see that it could go both ways. So like you're watching like, wow, is she just really imagining all this stuff, or is something really nefarious going on? And so the people around her, because they're not experiencing what she's experiencing and all they have to go on is what she's telling them, you can understand, while they're trying to be helpful to a point, you can understand why they're feeling a bit like, I don't know. I mean, the police even get involved. The husband goes so far as to try to confront the person and talk to them. So people are trying to accommodate her, but there's only so much they can do. You can't arrest somebody for looking at you across, in their apartment. So you can see there's this gray area, and she's frustrated, and the people around her start to get increasingly frustrated, especially her husband. And you can completely get that. See, that's the thing. He's not this totally jerky idiot guy who's completely dismissing what she's going through. He tries to help her to the best of his ability, but he's limited. So I appreciated the nuance there in that, and I appreciated that he didn't come off as this absolute butthole to her about it. But they touched on things like that in the Q&A, which I will get around to at the end of sort of talking about the story itself. So the guy who plays the dude the guy who is the focus of her suspicion was played by none other than Burn Gorman, and he is an absolutely fantastic actor. I love this guy. I have loved his work ever since I saw him in Torchwood. And then also he was in I think it was A&E or AMC, the series Turn, which was a fantastic series. I thought that was very well done. He played a guy, like a British soldier in there. Loved him in there. And he's creepy in here, but he also comes across as a bit sympathetic at certain points, but he plays it so well. I mean, the way he even just carries himself and the look on his face, he's such an effective actor. He was just really, really good in here. So it was great to see him in here. I had forgotten that his name was attached to this movie when I watched it. So then when it started to show him, and it doesn't start off showing him completely right away. You just see him from afar or just a little bit from the side. So you don't even really fully see his face until a bit into it. And when I saw him, I'm like, oh yeah, that's him. That's that guy. I love it. At first I did not recognize this actress, but then when I was watching the Q&A, they brought up the fact that she was in It Follows. So I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I know exactly who she is. And the guy who played her husband, I don't think I've seen him in anything, but I looked up his IMDb and I recognized the titles he's been in. So if I've seen him, I didn't notice him as an actor, but I thought he did a really good job in here. The acting just throughout this movie was really good. There's really only 4 main characters: the woman, her husband, her neighbor, and Burn Gorman's character. So it's kind of a small cast. So, there's not a whole lot of people that are involved in the bulk of the story. So it feels kind of sparse as far as that goes, but it's supposed to be that way. I think that kind of sort of underscores the whole feeling of just sort of being isolated, not many people, like what she was going through, if that makes any sense. So anyway, I enjoyed this film. I thought it was quite well done. I don't know that I would watch it again. I wouldn't mind it. Maybe if I watched it with, like, let's say my cousin or my son or whatever, my daughter, if they wanted to watch it. But it's not something that I would watch again on my own. But that's not because I didn't like it. It's just there's other films that have a higher rewatchability factor for me, even though I did enjoy this. One thing I wasn't crazy about was the abrupt end. I wish it had kind of gone on a bit longer, but at the same time, I don't really know what it could have shown that would have improved the ending. So maybe the abrupt end was appropriate. I did like that there were some surprising moments that happened in the climax of the movie, and I was like, oh, wow, this film is definitely going to go in a direction I was not anticipating. And how in the world is this going to, like, what this is going to be? This is it? And then it turned, and I was like, okay, wow, I really actually didn't see that coming. That one had me fooled. So I thought that was kind of interesting, the way they pulled that off. Now, moving on to the Q&A. In the Q&A, the reason that I started to get turned off of it right away is because the director, while I feel like she did a really good job pulling this movie together, especially for her first feature film, she kept harping on this about it. She was like emphasizing it was about being a woman and feeling like you're just not believed and you're constantly doubted and patronized by the men around you. I mean, she brought this up more than once. So it was like, I'm like, okay, well, I know what type of person you are. I don't really agree with that sort of viewpoint because, for one thing, there have been other movies where men are in the opposite position. Like, okay, Rear Window. Nobody believes him. But we don't go on and on about how, well, it's about being a man and he's patronized by the women around him and nobody believes him and he's constantly doubted, So I just did not appreciate her spin on that at all. I felt like it was a very kind of tunnel-visioned way to view things, thinking that this is something that is an exclusive issue for women only. This only happens to women, whereas this is something that happens across the board equally to men and women. This is not something that is just a burden that only us women have to bear in life. And I'm so over that sort of narrative, and it just like this constant, it's that divisiveness that I've brought up before. I don't appreciate that sort of thing. And when she started doing that, I'm like, oh my gosh. I paused it and I'm like, then I was like, oh, go ahead. I'll go ahead and finish listening to it. Well, it was watch and listen. But the guy who played her husband, he was in there, and it was this actress, the guy who played her husband, the director, and the lady with Sundance, and then they had an ASL. The guy was the only guy. He was the only guy in the discussion. I felt a little bit sorry for him because he sort of was like, yeah, well, I was kind of frustrated when I was reading about this character that I played. And yeah, I know that I'm guilty of kind of doing this, myself and in my past relationships. And, as men, we just try to fix things and we really need to just listen more. And I felt like, dude, stop beating yourself up. It's just the differences between men and women. This is the way we are, and you don't need to chastise yourself too much about stuff like that. But I guess he was in sort of this environment where maybe he felt compelled to say these things because he's surrounded by all these women, and if he doesn't, they might get annoyed with him. And maybe he really does feel that way. I get where he's coming from. But he did sort of kind of self-correct, and he was like, men, we blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, some men, and he said, but other people, he made some kind of reference to like that this is something that other people do too. In other words, men and women. He kind of sort of conceded that point. So I appreciated that he made that clarification. But I understood where he was coming from, but at the same time, I felt like maybe he was being a bit too hard on the character that he was playing, because I completely got where her husband was. I got both of them. That's the thing. I could see exactly where they both were coming from. There is something that he does at the end, towards the end, that's like, dude, that was just, you shouldn't have done that. But they're both kind of at their wits' end. So she also, her interaction with him during that particular scene was like, all right, chick, you need to chill. Try to understand where he's coming from. So in that case, they both sort of, I felt like were kind of equally contributing to the issue between them. Like I said, I'm not going to get specific. I don't want spoilers. But anyway, the director also talked about how, you know, the audience is going to be frustrated that her husband doesn't believe her, the people around her don't believe her. But I wasn't frustrated by that. I felt like a lot of the people around her were kind of going above and beyond what they really needed to do. She could have just been completely brushed off. That would have been more realistic. I felt like the help that the police tried to give to her and that her husband tried to give to her was very respectful and attentive. So I don't know, maybe I'm alone in that perception of what I was watching, but I kind of feel like the director was off base in that regard. But anyway, she also mentioned that she mentioned that the script was originally supposed to be based in New York, and the pandemic affected all of that. So then they ended up having it take place in Romania. They made some script changes. I feel like that was actually an excellent thing that happened, because having this movie take place in a foreign language, or you know, the story take place in a foreign language. This movie take place in a foreign language. Good Lord, what the heck? Having this movie take place in a foreign country for the main character, and her not being able to interact with the people around her, I felt like that sort of really helped add to this sense of isolation that the director talked about was kind of sort of, you know, a big element in the movie. I feel like that was just very, very effective sort of tool that was used to kind of hit that home. And so, yeah, I thought I liked. I think if it was set in New York, it probably wouldn't have had the same impact that it did being set in Romania. But anyway, I just felt like overall this was interesting. I'm glad I took the time and paid the money to watch it. But like I said, probably won't see it again. I do, however, feel like it's definitely worth the watch. This was put together pretty well, in my opinion, and the acting was really good. And if you're a fan of Burn Gorman, it's worth it just for that. He's not in here a huge amount because this film is mostly a focus on her and of course her husband, but mostly her. But it's still worth watching it just for him because he's so effectively creepy and such a good actor. Anyway, I guess that's it. I can't think of anything else to add about this, so I'm going to wrap it up and we'll see you guys later. Bye.